Welcome to The Plunge with Derekholser. Derek means business today. We're talking with a very good friend of mine. In fact, a person who has had as much influence on my formation and understanding of the deeper things of life in this world than just about anybody. Though we've only known each other for 7 years, my good friend Michael Di Fuccia has been an ever-present and meaningful guide over this period of my life. I am so grateful that he joined me for 2 conversations on Owen Barfield. A little bit about Mike. He is the director of the Cultura Fellowship at the Martin Institute for Christianity and Culture. He is a research fellow for the Center of Theology and Philosophy in Nottingham in the UK. He's a certified spiritual director through the Anglican diocese of New England. He joined his wife Sarah as they established Platform to Table, a nonprofit ministry for Christian leaders. Mike is a wealth of information, but more importantly, wisdom, patient, loving, gracious to all who know him. He's also an exceptional fisherman and quite a craftsman in his own right. If you check out his YouTube channel, Dr. Bass, you will enjoy his episodes in which he completely remakes fishing boats. He's truly a Renaissance man. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to my dear friend Mike for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. All right, man. We're here on the Central Coast, San Luis Obispo, Atascadero, technically, home of the Greyhounds. Run fast, boys. Mike, it's so good to get together with you. I met you almost 7 years ago. You came into my life at a very meaningful and pivotal moment with respect to what I was doing to find purpose, meaning, vocation, calling, all of those big concepts that are connected to how we look at the world, how we look at God, and how we look at our neighbor. And I'm so grateful that you came into my life. And one of the things that you brought with you was a stillness, believe it or not, that you were always reminding and reflecting and drawing us back to anchoring and centering ourselves in the eternal truths and goodness and beauty and truth that's all around us. So I'm really grateful that you are the linchpin for this Owen Barfield series, because a lot of his concepts come through in those conversations that you and I had almost every week at Roast Rider Coffee in Virginia Beach, Virginia. So thanks for doing this.
I'm grateful to be here and grateful for your friendship. I would say all the same things about you. So it's really cool that you're down here to visit and just hanging out with you again. So cool.
It's very fun. So I'd love for you to share your backstory as people are listening and watching, getting to know who is Michael Di Fuccia? Where did you come from? What were the kinds of things that occupied your time when you were a younger man?
Well, internally, I don't think I'm as still as you observe on the outside. How much time do you have? How much time do we have? I think, I grew up in a very working class family. I was a Christian from a young age. There's a bit of baggage with that too, what that meant and all that. But I liked sports, grew up playing sports. I was a BMX racer. I was outdoors all the time. I'm getting to the fact that I never really took books or anything seriously growing up. Everyone in my extended family, we worked in a union, in some form of trade, and that was my trajectory. So,
and what part of the country were you in?
Oh, so Erie, Pennsylvania, small town in the Great Lakes region where it snows a lot this time of year. And my family is still there. Yeah, I grew up there, a very working class town. In
football country?
Football, Big Ten, and then, of course, we had the Buffalo Bills, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Cleveland Browns all within like 90-mile radius of Erie. So you had these conflicting allegiances in the town. So yeah, you grew up working class, sports, didn't have any kind of sense of, even all through high school, my parents were like, I knew I should do well in school. I didn't enjoy any of it. I remember dreading the summer. Like, even when summer started, I was already prepping for going back to school. Like, oh gosh, it's like a month away.
Yeah.
I never really enjoyed school. Yeah, so came out of high school and then...
So how did you go from a kid who doesn't like school, which almost everyone can relate with, to a notable scholar? In my estimation.
I don't know if I'm...
You can just...
I think the first step towards that would have been, I was coaching high school track in football after graduating from high school, back at the same high school.
Were you in college?
No, I was working.
Okay.
The first year I was working toward a kind of union career like everybody
gotcha.
did in my family as a sheet metal worker. And people just kept telling me I should go to college. To this day, I don't know if that was a good decision, but there was a local state school, and I found out I could go pretty much for free because of the financial situation in my family with grants and things like that. And so I decided to study elementary education because I had this sense that I was good at teaching. I found myself mentoring, younger kids, and so that was the trajectory I went on. And towards the end of that, again, still in my hometown, nothing has really changed. I was intimidated by the idea of college, so I thought that elementary education would be maybe something I could handle. That
sounds easy.
Like I could handle that. And the other thing was, you do something, if you're going to invest in school, you have to have a return on investment, right? So I knew there were jobs in that field, but I also knew they wouldn't be in Pennsylvania because that was it just at the time, the area that I came from, there was a lot of good teachers, a lot of good educational districts, programs. And so I knew I'd have to move. But towards the end of that degree, I was going to church, a pretty healthy church community. I had been exposed to C.S. Lewis, and I'd never been, up until that point. I'm almost finishing college at this point. I've done all my all my high school, all my undergraduate, and now I'm reading someone who's thinking philosophically.
Yeah.
I'd never been exposed to that in my Christian life, in the people that in church, in school. I'd never taken a philosophy course. I had a very basic knowledge of the Christian faith, the typical Jesus saves and you go to heaven. And I'd never been exposed to anything like this. And that kind of opened something in me to maybe what would become further education at that point. And then I started to think, well, I like to teach. Maybe I'd like to be a professor. How do you go about doing that? I started to look into oblivious with literally had nobody around me that could guide me. And I suppose when I read C.S. Lewis, I realized that I had a lot of unconscious questions stirring in me that he was just bringing to the surface. And I remember thinking, I didn't know that people thought about these things. Yeah. And I felt a connection, like I had these questions about God or about my faith or even about the ultimate reality. And I just had no one to dialogue with. And so he became kind of my first dialogue partner. It was at a time where coffee shops were becoming kind of trendy. This would have been in like 2002, 2004, like that time. Yeah, so people were going to Barnes and Noble, and I would pull a book off a shelf. I'd get a drink, and I'd read it, and then go put it back on the shelf because I was poor. And that's kind of how that world opened up to me. Yeah.
So then you move from the invitation that Lewis is giving you to explore the deeper questions in your heart, even as you said, felt before that, even unknown to yourself. So you go from there, that triggers something, and you begin to explore, and you journey and find yourself in Nottingham in England. And I'm just curious about that trajectory, and in particular, how you landed in the studies that you did of the life of Owen Barfield.
Yeah, so it's a series of unfortunate events. No, I'm just kidding.
Lemony Snicket would be proud.
Yeah, or happy accidents. So I'm reading Lewis. There was a sense in me that, like I said, I would like to teach in college. How do you go about doing that? So again, with very little knowledge of the path or the kind of way I should go, I went to a kind of evangelical conservative seminary because that's the kind of background I came from. And I got into what was called a biblical studies, and they called it at the time predoctoral studies. It was the track you should take. It wasn't a master's of divinity. It was somewhere between an MA and an MDiv, which didn't have a lot of the ministry courses. So that was the difference. I did that, and that was kind of this deconstructing period for me, even though it was funny. I went to school being told, you shouldn't go get an education in this because you're going to become an atheist. And that is true for some people. And I went through this kind of deconstruction period. I had a few professors there that were kind of feeding me stuff on the side that wasn't in the mainstream of the courses. I found myself again reading more philosophy probably than theology at the time because I was interested in the bigger questions. And by the time I had finished, I'd wrote a thesis on foundationalism is kind of the idea, because at one point within that, I suppose after reading Lewis, not that Lewis is like this, but I tended towards the more American evangelical interpretations of Lewis. That meant he's an apologist. How am I going to defend my faith? I kind of went down that road, and I think existentially during that time when doing my master's degree, I kind of had an internal sense in me that I was building my faith on reason, or on the idea of something, a straw man, essentially, is what someone would call that. Like, I believed in an idea about God that I had constructed, very well-meaning, but it didn't go internally to me. And during that time, I realized, like, if someone kind of pulled one of those locks out, like Jenga or something, the whole thing had crumbled down.
Yeah.
And I had kind of come to that. And what I realized at the moment was, like, now I have to have faith. Like, what is that? Like, what does it mean to cling to God now that I don't have this construct that I had kind of like built, stringing together biblical passages and, different ideas, how we do those things. That all kind of came crumbling down.
Yeah. I often think of that as like a hierarchy of proof text. Various confessions have their own hierarchy of which verses stand atop the heap that we hold on to prove mostly our ideas that you're talking about, those constructs. So how did you get to Nottingham?
I think at that stage I started to think, if Jesus is real, if this whole thing is real, it has to have a vision for ultimate reality. It can't be a kind of Gnostic faith that kind of is secretive to me, that doesn't relate to the world any longer. And it needed to be far more robust. I just had this sense. And at that time, I'd already finished my master's thesis. And I was kind of done. Like, I was burnt out. I didn't want to do anything. And then I read, again, one of the same professors, Skip Horton Parker was his name. He was instrumental in guiding me in that time. He gave me an article by John Milbank called Postmodern Critical Augustinianism. And
riveting title.
Yeah. And essentially what I experienced in reading that was, here is somebody who is like, when I encountered Lewis, oh my goodness, he is asking questions that I don't even know to ask. He is narrating Christianity in a way that is able to absorb these other meta-narratives or theories about ultimate reality, you could say. And he's taking the good and sifting the good in them, but saying this is how Christianity kind of perfects these competing narratives in a time of what's called postmodernity, where you get the idea that there's not one narrative, but there's multiple, and they could all be equally kind of valid. He was saying, well, yeah, let's take all of them and then see how there is some truth in these. And he was able to enter into dialogue with kind of any discipline. And that was the thing. I was like, okay, this is a way of understanding Christianity in terms of like ultimate reality, in a more cosmic vision of the faith that I was longing for. And I knew that the one that I had created, the kind of image of God, or the God of my misunderstanding, I say sometimes, was not capable of doing that. And here it was, this very great confidence, great hope, but also kind of not overly rationalistic, yet to this day, one of the most intelligent articulations, like a living articulations of the faith I've ever encountered. But yet caught up in the idea that, like, ultimately this is only known through praise and worship. And I was like, wow. Then that really connected back to like maybe my more charismatic parts of me, the idea that philosophy culminated in liturgy and in worship and language, and all these things were so fascinating. So long story short, I ended up contacting John, interacting with him over email, applied to the University of Nottingham because that's where he was, applied to Oxford, applied to St. Andrews. I wasn't accepted to St. Andrews. I was accepted to Oxford, but the supervisor that they had assigned me to had told me in previous emails he didn't think he'd be great to supervise me. And that was a bit weird. And ultimately the idea that when you got the acceptance letter of Nottingham, it said that my supervisor would be John. And I was like, well, this is pretty cool. Like, yeah. And so the next thing we know, I met John. He was at Georgetown University giving lectures there for the Tocqueville Forum there. And yeah, ended up over there in 2010. Yeah.
And we is who?
My wife. The poor thing I dragged over there. Yes, I've been married. We've been married for almost 20 years. So
congrats.
She's been there on this journey with me for sure. Yeah.
How did you guys meet?
We met while I was coaching sports at a high school. Her younger brother, was one of my vaulters. I coached pole vaulting. And he was a good kid. He was always like, hey, you should meet my sister.
Yeah.
And I knew her because she had went to high school, but she was too cool for me as far as I knew. We were both going to the same local university at the time, and we met. A very romantic date. I took her on to a Chinese buffet, as you do, and we went to watch the Bone
guessing
Collector.
It was number one.
Yeah, you can tell it wasn't two. It definitely wasn't two. Then the rest is history. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we have commonality once again.
Yeah.
Because it was through education. I was teaching that a family member introduced me to my wife.
Yeah.
So congrats. Romance blooms on the Central Coast.
Yeah.
To come. It's really cool, man. And Sarah's friendship and
the listeners, like, we're really good friends. Like, people need to know that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not just a normal interview for you. This is like, no.
We're doing very well at keeping it professional.
The other interviews that you do are not, you're not this excited to do.
Easily
right?
derail. just so we're clear on what's happening here.
Yeah.
We're holding it together, though.
Yeah.
So, Barfield,
Yeah.
the reason we're here, you and Sarah are in Nottingham.
Yeah.
You're under the supervision of John Milbank.
Yeah.
And you're diving deep into the concepts of Barfield. How did you choose that? I assume John guided you in that direction. And how did that manifest?
Again, another humiliating, humbling moment of my life. I had been working with John for like 8 months by this time. I'm committed. We've moved all the way over there. I'm working on a project where all I kind of understood was what I would now describe as a sacramental vision of the world of reality, which essentially sees things as real, and we can get into this maybe, but as real signs of God, as opposed to like God only exists maybe in me and in the church. There was this larger vision that I was trying to...
Can we just talk about that in particular again? Because, the desire for these conversations is for them to be more accessible to the lay person, so to speak. And you're talking about that evangelical notion of the individuality of the relationship between the individual and through Jesus to God, right? As opposed to what you're talking about, the reality of God made manifest in all creation, but it's not pantheism where you're worshiping the trees as it's so often characterized. So could you unpack that a little bit?
I think that I grew up understanding that my relationship with God was unmediated, in the sense that like it was kind of this way, and that left me existentially with the feeling that God had nothing to do with anything kind of outside of things, and then the world itself can then begin to look very kind of grim. There's this sacred thing I have at church, I have in my prayer time, but the rest of this profane kind of existence that I learned to push away. Yeah. And after that kind of unfolding that I spoke of earlier, I had come across literature and things that were saying that God can be mediated as well. I'm not making any claim as to whether that is actually a mediated relationship or unmediated, but that the gift of God and His grace can be mediated through people, can be through very mundane things, can be mediated through the natural order. And you brought up pantheism. Yeah, I mean, pantheism would be more like Christianity would call that like a form of idolatry, which we could talk more about, worshiping the creature rather than the creator. The way I've described this to students would be like when Aquinas says something like effects resemble their causes. So the creation resembles its cause. It's like when our grandmother might knit us something unique in maybe a blanket, and we cover ourselves with that blanket. There's something very symbolically powerful about that blanket, because it's not just some blanket I went to Walmart and purchased. It has like literally the fingerprints of a person. And so the world itself then takes on that dimension because it's created by God. It's His kind of handiwork. This is biblical, right? Or its fingerprints are literally all meshed within it. And so you treat it differently then. Yeah, you see it differently. You don't just burn you don't just go to Walmart to replace the thing your grandmother gave you. That's not what's going on here. There's a person. There's a very personal thing. And so the creation itself then becomes a gift, right? Yeah. This is John Milbank's, a lot of Catholic theology is gift.
Would you then say also that its origin speaks to its end? That because of the process whereby it came into being, the force behind that being your grandmother's love, its purpose and utility is valued differently.
Yeah, it almost reorders us towards that in this case, an object. But it has this subjective dimension to it already, because it points back to your grandmother again. And we treat it very differently. And it's the same thing as like a wedding ring, although this isn't my wedding ring. You know, we wear these now.
That's because you got to lift when you're getting swollen.
But if of course. Yeah. But if I lose the wedding ring, it's not the value of the ring. Like, I can go and replace it. Right. There's something very unique about that ring in particular.
Yes.
And so that's a kind of a Christian way of viewing the creation, or as God being mediated, his presence being mediated through things. We're not worshiping these things, but we see God's work through them. Yeah. And so I wanted to do something like this on a more philosophical, metaphysical level in 8 months into my PhD. So I'm thinking I'll get this thing done in 3 years, and I'm sitting at a coffee shop with John Milbank, and he looks at me and he goes, "Michael, you don't have the theological pedigree to do this project. In fact, Adrian Pabst is almost done with it. He's been working on it for like 10 years. And you know, when you get really depressed and your head's down and I felt like I was like walking like this back to my apartment, like, oh my God, this is all a scam. Like I've been found out.
Like you went to tryouts for the varsity.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And they're like, you're not even making JV, dude. Like this was it. And I was like, oh, he knows. He knows. I mean, up to that point, John was already like just interacting with him. I still joke to this day. I say that there's an infinite qualitative difference between John's intellect and mine, and I will never surpass that. But I can remember times of him like pronouncing Henri de Lubac or something like that. I'd never heard of anybody that he was mentioning. It was so humiliating. I was like, can you spell that for me? So
can you spell it for us now?
Yeah. He
I'm serious.
Henri de Lubac.
Who's Henri de Lubac?
Yeah, he was part of the Ressourcement, like Catholic movement that
don't feel bad if you don't know who Henri de Lubac is.
John Milbank's thought, but also wrote a lot on the supernatural, the idea that it wasn't grace and nature were more closely intertwined, which of course this idea of sacramental vision of reality was very impactful. But do you really want me to spell it? It's like Henry with an I at the end.
Oh, yes.
And then
Henri.
D-E, yeah.
Yes.
And then D-E and then space Lubac, L-U-B-A-C.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, see, look at me. Now I've kind of come, look how far I've come.
Yeah.
I can spell a French guy's name.
Well done.
Yeah. And so in Adrian's book, what is amazing, it came out in 2000. It would have been like 2 years after John said that to me. Mm-hmm. And it was a project he'd worked on as a student of John's at Cambridge, and then came out a couple, I think 10 years. And I'll never be able to write that book. And it's fantastic. It's called Metaphysics, the Creation of Hierarchy. It's not for the faint of heart. But I actually cite it in the Barfield book. While I'm doing my PhD, that book had come out. So it was very helpful and influential for me. So at that time, John says to me, but, he knew I had a lot of catching up to do. Mm-hmm. He knew that. He was very aware of that. But he said, what about Owen Barfield? I had no idea who Owen Barfield was. No clue. This is 8 months into my PhD. I'd never read him because I think John knew this idea of participation, which we can get into, the idea of seeing God in all things. That was, at least interiorly, I was interested in sorting out what that meant, like, intellectually. And historically, all these things did. And so when I started reading Owen Barfield, I said, John has a point. Like, at the time, and even still, I mean, you don't hear many people who know Barfield's work. And so it was like a clean slate to work from, which can be good and bad. There wasn't a ton of secondary literature at the time. There really isn't still now. I guess some of it's coming out. So it was both a lot of work, but also something that chimed with, I think, the trajectory that I was on at the time.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And so that led to the creation of this masterpiece.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to dive into the book.
Okay. Yeah.
So the book is entitled Owen Barfield, Philosophy, Poetry, and Theology, Michael Vincent DeFuscia. You quote C.S. Lewis at the beginning of the book, and as you mentioned, Lewis was your gateway drug to this world.
Yeah.
Lewis refers to Barfield as the wisest and best of my unofficial teachers, who towers above us all. And I'm curious because it may be, based on what you just mentioned about no secondary literature, it may be Barfield could be described as the overlooked inkling. I don't know. If this is the case, is it? What is Lewis driving at when he makes that claim?
The truth is, I don't really know. I mean, I suspect in their interactions that we were aware of that he had a big influence on Lewis. I don't think he would be credited with Lewis's conversion, but maybe as part of that, because Barfield doesn't become like an orthodox, like confessing Christian until I think 50 years old. But I think even when in some of the correspondence between Lewis and Barfield, particularly this thing called the Great War, very early on, just after they graduate from Oxford, you can see the intellect in Barfield and in Lewis, and you can see how Barfield challenged a lot. And to the day, I think, Lewis passes. They don't continue. They continue to kind of like bump heads, but he's an intellect that Lewis is obviously impressed by, and then you see that come through in a quote like that. There's also a letter, and I don't know if it's public, that I read at the Bodleian. The Bodleian was kind of this full circle moment for me. I first exposed to theology.
What is the Bodleian?
It's the library at Oxford, the round building. Looking through the Barfield collection there, it was a full circle moment to me because it's coming towards the end of my PhD and reading these handwritten letters from C.S. Lewis to Owen Barfield, where Lewis was the first guy that I ended up with, studying in Inkling, not even intentionally, but there's a letter that says something, and it might be somewhere public, but I feel like it's in a letter where Lewis says, I was just having a lunch or dinner with Tolkien last night, and he never gets up in front of a class. He teaches the same subject that Barfield is an expert in, which is called philology. It means the history, where you study the history of the meaning of words, like how that might change over time. Mm-hmm. And he says he said Tolkien told me he never gets up in front of a class without thinking of your theory of the evolutionary history of words, something along those lines. So you can see how influential told Lewis at a dinner
is influenced by Barfield's theory of the evolution of
evolutionary history of the change of word meaning.
Okay.
How a word can actually change subtly over time, the meaning of a word. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very interesting.
In this, then, of course, other people have noted how this feeds into like Tolkien's theory of splintered light and these things. Anyway, we can maybe get to that at some point.
Yeah. That sounds good. So my next question for you on that note is, as you talked about Lewis and Barfield butting heads on occasion over the course of their friendship, it's been termed the Great War.
Yes.
Not by me,
yeah.
But you wrote an article on that. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the Great War, what it consisted of, as people understand it in the Lewis Barfield circles, and also just your perspective regarding any potential misunderstandings as to the nature or maybe the animosity I mean, they were really friends.
And Lewis makes these comments like about how great friendship is this. It's kind of this back and forth. So they had deep mutual respect for each other. The Great War is a series of letters that Lewis and Barfield exchanged shortly after. They were both very young. Again, my biographical information on Lewis is not good. I think that Lewis is not a Christian yet. It's shortly after that they're students together at Oxford. That's how they meet. Barfield had moved back to London for work, and Lewis was still, I believe, in Oxford at the time. So they start exchanging these letters. And what Barfield would refer to that as later in life was that it was a debate about the truthfulness of the imagination, or the imagination as a means to truth. At the time, of course, Lewis is still very young, but they're both very young. But Barfield always believed that the German and the British romantics, that the imagination was like an exalted form of reason.
Okay.
So like it could actually take you kind of beyond what a simple discursive reason could do. And what typical consensus, if you just walk away from that, I think it's like a 4-year period they exchange these letters. It's been since published by the Inkling's Journal, the Journal of Inkling Studies, whatever the one in Oxford is called. It's a supplemental edition to that. So it's out. Like anyone can get it and read it now. For when I was studying, I had to go to the library, the Bodleian, to see these. I think I didn't see the whole thing. I can't quite remember. But by the time I published that book, I had all that.
Yeah.
By the time my PhD turned into a book like 2 years later. Yeah, so I was able to see all of it by the time I did that. But this article that you reference, all I was really trying to do was say that I think it's kind of unfair to say that Lewis had a low view of the imagination. In other words, from that period of time, you might think that Lewis doesn't really, or if you're only reading his nonfiction work. And so because that article was published in the Oxford Journal of Literature and Theology, or Theology and Literature, it had to incorporate literature. So for me, I said, well, while this might be the case with the Great War, I also look at much later correspondence with them. I kind of make the argument that later on in life, they pretty, maybe they don't agree completely, but you see this in, you see that Lewis has a high view of the I mean, all of what the Inklings were doing, if that's not a high view of the imagination, I don't know what is. Yeah. They saw the best way of conveying Christian truths were not philosophy papers. They were stories. I mean, and so I'm basically saying, like, even if Lewis, in the rational side of Lewis, I was also trying to pull Lewis away from my kind of early origins of the evangelical readings of him that were only reading this kind of like rationalist apologist type person. Yeah, the stories were good, but like Lord of the Rings might be a little sketch because it's dealing with wizards and stuff. You know what I mean? Like, so being like, no, this is really at the heart of this for these figures. They're articulating this by the use of the imagination. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So their portrayal would be, I think, in line very much with the example set by Jesus, who used parables, right? Yeah. And it seems as though they were each continuously honing that craft in their relationship with one another. Yeah. And perhaps this was part of that back and forth, right?
And I think the irony is that Barfield was all for the imagination, and he wrote fiction, but Lewis was way better at it.
Gotcha.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And yet he was saying, no, we need to be more rationalist, you know, about...
Interesting to see if other guests on this series agree with your...
Yeah, they might not agree with that, because I know you're going to spend some time talking about the Barfield's fiction work, which is great. It just hasn't been picked up like Lewis's, and it's certainly not as prolific either.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's an interesting phenomenon to me as a writer myself, like that dynamic of where a story pierces the cultural zeitgeist and becomes a phenomenon, which is what happened with the Chronicles of Narnia, happened with the Lord of the Rings, happened with the Hunger Games, happened with Twilight, you know, the vampire.
With Boy 39.
Right.
That's
Amazon.
That's
Boy 39.
It's really, I'm not just saying that.
Yeah. Stranger Things, the Duffer Brothers were coming.
They stole it.
They did. Anyway, but genuinely, I don't know if it's always the case that the best literature is as widely received, is my point. Yeah. So Barfield, I feel this way about George MacDonald, as you know. Very compelling work, very meaningful, transcendent stories, and yet virtually unknown still, and almost completely unknown 40 years ago. Yeah. With Barfield, too, I think it's very enjoyable for me, and hopefully for others, to look behind the scenes of the artifice that we've all inherited. Yeah. Here's C.S. Lewis. He's the go-to for all things. If you have any questions, who did he learn from? And what were their concepts? And where did he disagree? And maybe he has some ideas that I would also disagree with, but I'm afraid to because he's C.S. Lewis, right? He's just below the Trinity. So how do I have the courage even to explore concepts, particularly for those of us who grew up in a culture of protectionism and isolation? How do I have the courage to ask the questions out loud, and where is the place I can go to do that?
I think you and I are both a little suspicious of very popular, trendy kind of modes of this. And Kierkegaard has that short essay called "The Crowd is Untruth." And I often think of that. If something becomes very popular in Christianity, I don't know how long it's going to stay around. Yeah, and only in hindsight do we normally know. There is a quote by a guy named, I think is pronounced Lionel Addy, who kind of first brought the Great War to like the masses it's like titled "The Great War" between Lewis and Barfield or something like that. And he says something like, in the long term, he thinks Barfield's stuff will be more popular in the long term. It just hasn't yet. So time will tell.
Time will tell.
And now you're bringing it to the masses.
Here we go. Yes. Well, time will tell. Yeah. All right. We're going to dive into poetic language.
Ooh, okay.
okay? And there's a lot of conversation in Barfield's work and in your book about poetic language. And so I want to start at the very foundation of this because it can have a connotation, right, where we just think about rhyming words.
Yes.
Right? But that's not what we're talking about necessarily here. Could you describe what you mean when you write, and this is in your book, page 14, I'm prepared.
A book that was written now almost 10 years ago, so forgive me.
Timeless is always timely, Michael.
You're right. You're right.
So you write, Barfield's most fundamental philologic, I can't say that word.
Philological.
Philological. There we go,
yeah.
philological, right? So we're talking about the study of
the meaning of
words. So Barfield's most fundamental thesis there is that such divisions, that is subject-object, spirit-matter, what you referred to as sort of Gnostic ideas, come later in the evolutionary history of consciousness, but are not actual. What in the world does that mean?
I'd like to turn that back to you. It is, let me try to put this, the way that I see Barfield's theory of language and how it evolves and how it changes over is also related to how consciousness evolves, how the way we perceive the world evolves, and then the way that we actually live evolves, like sociologically, how we relate.
Is he talking about as an entire species, as an individual, both?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say it's both. It's a both and. I'm not 100% sure if I never had a chance to talk to Owen Barfield, if I'm right about this. But what poetic, to answer the question of poetic language for him, the idea of poetry is the idea of what I would loosely describe as what we talked about earlier, a sacramental vision. For what Owen Barfield, what he means by that is his theory. Typically, when you think of how someone attains language nowadays, if you watch a baby, for example, I mean, I've never had a child. You would, please correct me if I'm wrong, they normally associate objects with words initially. Like Augustine even talks about this in Confessions, how we obtain language. And then later on, what happens is we develop a language for our interior, well, some of us do, to express how we feel and the things that are inside of us. So the first thing, I mean, a baby might express anger by crying or something like this, or frustration, but they then can actually develop a language for the inside of the world, right? The inside of the cells, the inside of the things they see, like beauty, this interior sense of the world. And so in his time, it was very popular to think of, for example, a caveman. You think in terms of the caveman must have been grunting and said woman, these very low views we have of the caveman. And you can think of like Chesterton's orthodoxy. He's critical of this, what Lewis, I think, calls chronological snobbery. The idea that the further you go back, we get more stupid, right? There's a philosophical case to be made that I don't think we have time to articulate, that in someone like Aristotle, who prioritizes the actual over the possible, for those who know philosophy will know what I'm talking about. All I'm doing is saying that Barfield's theory of language matches up with this kind of Platonic Aristotelian vision of how things unfold within the order of things. Like, so in the world, I go from potential to actual. And this is my mentor, Simon Oliver's teaching. It's not my own. In the world, a child goes from potentially being able to speaking language to actually speaking. But the only reason the child can do that is because the actual in metaphysical reality is prior to the potential. Is pre-existent. So and it's that actuality that draws the potentiality to something. And so Barfield's, his philological thesis of the meaning of words is that they don't start as roots, that at the origins of language and the creator, the logos, we can talk about this, or in Trinitarian language, that language is very advanced, it's as high and advanced as a kind of worship and praise. And only in the created order do we see where we begin to participate that as infants, and we mature into that. But it has to be actual first. And so for him, this poetic vision, this poetic language is prior. It's where in reality things are. And if it weren't there, we wouldn't be able to develop into more profound interior forms of language. So he thinks that language begins as metaphor. It begins as I always tell people in the Silmarillion in Tolkien,
Yeah.
so this is a perfect picture of how Barfield thinks about the origins of like not only creation, but it's this very poetic vision that Tolkien is painting. And that's kind of, at least as I understand it, Tolkien's conception is Barfield, and it might be where Tolkien is getting this idea when he says to Lewis, I don't ever teach philology without thinking of Barfield's theory. So to get back to the question of poetic language, again, we tend to think in terms of, we have like root meanings to things, and over time, like man must have, like as a species, but also then as, which is true, like develops a more articulate language. But Barfield thinks at its origins, language begins poetic and then becomes what he calls prosaic, like interior versus exterior. So like nouns versus like an interior adjectival kind of language. And this becomes sundered over time. And he says you can see this not only when you go study primitive tribes, the way that they talk about, the way that like they articulate themselves through like a kind of poetic existence, and they're very spiritually capable of seeing the inside of the world. And then we separate these kind of things out. We say, well, we can talk about this interior world, but we don't know if it's real or not.
Right.
But what's really real is this objective material world. And so if we want to be truthful, we should kind of focus on that.
Gotcha. And
he's seeing these two things like part ways, not only in the history of language, because he said if you actually look back, all nouns were once like verbs, is what he says. They were all movement, they were inspired. And it's only over time that metaphors become like cliches. So he says this, you can actually see this when you look at the history of words. Like, and this is what his books do, like his earlier books from when he was just finishing at Oxford, like history and English words, poetic diction. That's what they're talking about.
So in a way, I guess, as you mentioned, the primitive way of communicating, they are more in touch with the reality that all the world is enlivened.
Yes.
And we have dissected the world and categorized it, and in so doing have killed it.
Yeah, he would definitely say, I mean, he's not alone in that. I mean, there's a lot of these genealogies now is really trendy in like philosophical or theological, like a genealogy of thought, a genealogy of consciousness. We can clearly see how our consciousness, the way we perceive things changes.
Right.
So he's not alone in this at
Right.
all. I think he was kind of a forerunner to it in the fact that he insisted upon this more poetic vision at a time where even in Lewis is not very comfortable with that, particularly early on. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, if I could go back, you made a point about the object or the created order being pre-existent to the language that describes or attaches to it. And I know that those words fall short of really explaining exactly how Barfield thought of this.
Yeah.
Because it's almost kind of mystical as I explore it. But I then, if you'll humor me, I thought about how you love fishing.
Yeah.
And you go out to what appears to be the blank slate of the waters, but you're attempting, casting over and over again to attach to that thing that you know is there. Yeah. And perhaps that's something about what's happening when we articulate the world around us. I don't know if that makes any sense as an analogy.
Yeah, I think like I have so many questions about formal cause in fishing. Like, why is it that all the bass bite the same way on a certain day and want the same thing? That's an argument for formal cause.
Tell me what that means.
It just means that
because you're like Mike is like fisher man.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah,
you are. And by the way, jump on YouTube, which you probably already are since you're watching this, and go find Dr. Bass and subscribe to Mike's channel where he rebuilds bass boats. Yeah. It's extraordinary.
It will change your life.
It changed mine. You are truly a fisherman. You love it. Yeah. I am not. So I observe this in you. So what does formal cause have to do with the way bass
Well, there's a lot of philosophy. A book needs to be written on this because also the idea of going out to fish is always based on the possible, right? You know, like the possibility of catching a fish as opposed to actually catching fish. Yeah, it's the actual that drives me to get out there.
No, I really want to park here for real. Like, what does it mean?
Formal cause is the idea that we don't really talk about anymore, but it would be as simple as like why you and I are here today.
Great question.
There are, who knows? There are, like, we live in a world where increasingly we want to give mechanical descriptions of why you and I are here today basically reduce it down to that we don't really have a will. It's just a cause and effect, chains of things bumping into you. That's the idea of mechanism. So we're here based on a set of circumstances of our upbringing, of things we ran into, of things, but we don't really desire to be here. If we do, it's only because, but the formal cause would be more talking about something like desire in human beings.
Okay.
Like, what is it that gets me up in the morning to go read the books that I read? Like, that cannot be, as much as we would like to reduce it to mechanical causation, there's an infinite qualitative difference between physical reality and the kind of things like desires that actually move us. So the mind-brain thing is consciousness versus physical material matter. That difference is always going to be there. And we could talk a lot more about that. David Hart's book, The Experience of God, is super good at just describing those differences. But with fishing, what's fascinating about formal cause is that it's like, that it also is, this is also coming back in quantum physics, like the idea of non-locality. Like, what is it that one thing over here can share in the same kind of movement as something unattached to it, like that
at least we can perceive.
We can't perceive this, right?
It's attachment.
But for Aristotle, like, formal cause was the thing that just moved everything, moved things from potential to actual. So, and he sees this most in the natural order. That what is it that causes an acorn to become a tree? You cannot reduce that down. And the formal cause is the end towards which something is moving, but it's also the thing we point to when we point to any object. It's not just mere materiality for him. And there's great philosophical arguments to be made for that. When it comes to fishing, though,
yes,
the question is, why on any given day is the whole population of bass reacting to the same bait, the same retrieval? You could call it the way I'm retrieving, or bass fishermen call it the presentation. It's like
here's your night crawler.
I'm like, yeah, here. Yeah. Like, why is it that they're all like, they're not going around and convening that morning being like, hey, we're only eating like Texas rigged crawdads this morning, but we're not having anything. In fact, it should be a blue color because, and that is something it's very fascinating. Like, why is it? What is ordering that kind of thing? And they're not convening, deciding that one day, like, and that's really hard to reduce down to just mere mechanics.
Fascinating.
Anyway, yeah.
So would it be fair to say in Christian language that the formal cause could be akin to the spirit?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think it's always been in David Bentley Hart, who I really respect. In one of his books, like, he says this directly, and I've always wondered it. And he says something like, basically, he conflates the formal cause with the soul.
Gotcha.
It's the thing that moves us from actual to potential.
Sure.
It's the thing that desires. It's the thing that wants to know. It's the thing that, and this is a very Aristotelian principle. Anima, the idea of something being animated, is where we get the language of the soul from. So anything that had locomotion, and could move towards something. Plants aren't often thought of as having souls, but animals.
And they move toward the sunlight.
But it doesn't
very
mean
obviously.
that there's not a formal cause involved. But particularly for Aristotle, that's what distinguished animals from plants, was locomotion, the ability to move from one place to another. Because you could desire something and literally.
I see.
But you're like, you're right. You see this in plant, like you think of the sunflower, literally can just rotate towards something. Yeah.
But theirs would be fixed in terms of geography and
right? No
so,
locomotion.
Right.
It can't move. Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But that doesn't mean, I don't think you would want to then cut off the idea that there isn't. But you mentioned the term spirit. Yeah, I mean that can mean a million different things.
Right.
For some people, that just means something that's not material. For Barfield, that means the immaterial. For some, that's the formal. So in Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy, and this is mostly in the early Christian tradition up until probably the Middle Ages, you get this idea of what's called hylomorphism, that the world is composed of form and matter. It's called the hylomorphic compound. So everything we see is a kind of formal cause combined with a materiality. And for Christians, God is the cause of the material cause as well. Like, creates material. you'll never see material without a form. And the higher you go in the hierarchy of being, the more that form becomes more obvious, soulish almost. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump into the next question. I'm going to be interviewing a gentleman named Max Leaf about Rudolf Steiner's influence on Barfield's thought. And it's fair to say Rudolf Steiner is quite influential in Barfield. Perhaps he's just as equally overlooked. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
But you point out that Barfield's I'm not going to say that word today.
Philological. Also not going to say
anthroposophy.
Yeah, you pronounce it
You're going to say anthroposophy.
I had to go on YouTube last night because I always say, I don't remember what I say. Anthroposophy is how I've always pronounced it. But we listened to lectures last night, and I'm wrong. Derek's right, so he'll be pronouncing that.
You say philological, and I'll say anthroposophy.
Anthroposophy.
Anyway, Steiner, the originator of anthroposophy, but in this regard, you wrote that Barfield's philological bent placed him above Steiner and stands out as a formidable corrective to modern and postmodern discourse. So I'm curious if you could elaborate on their connection, the concept of anthroposophy, and why you believe Barfield is a formidable corrective to postmodern ideologies.
I think what I'm saying is that with just Steiner on his own, there's not anything really there to outwit philosophically, because he's not really a philosopher. But in Barfield, there's a lot to draw on, and there are.
So this would be in the domain of classical philosophical.
Steiner's not doing that. He's just, essentially founding a kind of religious movement in some ways. Mm-hmm. It's a bit Gnostic, but some people they're comfortable with that. So that's all I would say. I know Barfield probably wouldn't say that. He would probably say, and maybe this is me trying to wrest Barfield from that dynamic, because I think that dynamic will scare a lot of Christians. Mm-hmm. That he never changed his views on that. He being
Barfield.
Barfield never changed his views on anthroposophy. He never does, even when he becomes a Christian. Yeah. So, but I think what I was saying, what Barfield is doing, philosophically, is more useful for the project I was for sure. Yeah.
So then, could you give your own understanding of anthroposophy?
Yeah. So I don't know a great deal about it. I've read a lot about it. The first chapter of the book, I wanted to be clear on it. I think just for the sake of people listening, it's just easier if I kind of articulate the evolution of consciousness. So this is the big premise of Steiner's work. The way what he believes happens over the history of time is that spirit comes to incarnate matter. So this is the evolutionary history. We have this Darwinian view of natural selection and a material kind of vision of how things come together. He is literally wanting to create an account of the spiritual kind of evolution. Okay. And that's where this, as I understand it, the origins of this come from. And so he believes that over successive periods of time, he basically has these three epochs, is what you might say, these three kind of moments in history. The first one is where spirit comes to pervade matter. These celestial beings come and they inhabit matter. And at that time, they're very aware of their spiritual origins. They're very connected to the spiritual world, even though they're inhabiting matter. Mm-hmm. He sees the Christ event, as particularly John's gospel, as super significant in this, because Christ is the God becoming human, becoming incarnate. But he says over time, what happens is man loses a sense of his spiritual origins and becomes more kind of obsessive with tinkering with materiality. He kind of forgets this. And what he wants to do through pedagogy, through the imagination, he believes by using the imagination, we can move to a future stage of consciousness where man is now more both aware of his material existence, like we very much are today, but also very much in touch with this spiritual origins, and he believes the imagination is the way to bring this back to our conscious awareness. Yeah. It's about consciousness. It's not about whether these are highly debatable. It's more about perception, as it might be ontology, like an actual change within the reality of things.
I see.
Now, I don't know what Steiner thinks about that.
Sure.
And with Barfield, my sense is it's not about ontology either, like spirit and matter actually changed their relationship. It's more about our perceptions of things. And so for Barfield, he has this idea of original participation, which is this early stage where humans are very in touch with their spiritual origins. Spirit and matter are kind of like dwelling together.
And is this a historical period of time?
It is pre-philosophy. It would be behind Aristotle. I want to say that when you, even in Plato, I haven't read any references in Barfield where he's critical of Plato. He starts to become critical of Greek thought in Aristotle. Okay. Because to him, and this is, this is debatable. There are some people who think that Aristotle moves on from Plato in that he separates, the famous Michelangelo where Aristotle is pointing up and Plato is pointing down. That it's called something in Athens or something like this. That's the kind of standard view that Aristotle breaks from, and he's no longer a kind of Platonist. And so he's very critical of Aristotle for categorizing things, like starting to parse things out. And he's all into these ideas of wholeness and things like that. And so how this fits is that he sees, like, at this stage, this undoing now of material, and you think of the hylomorphic compound again, spirit and matter come together, or formal cause and materiality holding together in all things. Well, he sees these begin to separate as early as Aristotle. Okay. In this, he calls the alpha thinking stage. This is the stage that in Steiner, you're losing a sense of your spiritual origins. And then like Steiner, he believes that the imagination will move us into what he calls a spirit of final participation, where man can now take all these technological prowess that he has, this ability to tinker and really work with the material world, but recover the spiritual origins. So it's a kind of brief overview of how two of those, in my understanding, fit together.
It's interesting because the idea of the spirit coming down to matter, first of all, it's articulated in Genesis. The spirit hovered over the face of the deep. But also it's explicit in things like the book of Enoch. It's in ideas surrounding those that believe in the pre-existence of souls. And in particular, during the silent period between the Old and New Testament, which I just happened to have studied, Second Temple Judaism period,
I remember that.
There were concepts where the pre-existence of souls was quite prevalent.
Yeah, and it is in early Christianity.
And it was sort of, as you described, the spirit gets distracted to the lesser and baser things and becomes enmeshed therein and eventually loses, as Steiner articulates. So anyway, I guess my point in bringing that up is that Steiner's ideas, at least in part, are long preceding him.
They're not foreign, for sure. You're exactly right. And that's very Platonic too, the pre-existence of the soul. And this is where Barfield gets the idea of reincarnation from. And I think that's Steiner as well. I'm pretty sure that's where that comes from as well. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And it falls on the question of whether this is an ontology for them.
What does that mean?
Spirit descending into matter, if that changes the relationship between spiritual world and the physical world, or the material world and the formal world, or the world of wholeness, whether that actually is changing. Because in Steiner's cosmology, it sounds like it is, but am I to read that as a mythology, or am I to read that as I don't know how, I bet they even disagree on how to read that, or whether it's just a matter of perceptions again. Like reality holds, the ontology, the reality stays the same. It's always this hylomorphic thing. We just lose perception of it, and we need to regain perception of it. I tend to think in Barfield that he thinks reality doesn't change the way we think, but our perceptions do. And I don't know if Steiner, where he would fall on that, or I might not even be right about Barfield.
That's interesting. Well, it's, at least to me, mythology, going back to your earlier point about how language, consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, mythology has to be connected to some real
Yeah.
event.
Oh, yeah. It always
right?
is. And that's how
So,
they would understand that too.
Yeah.
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 It's saying, it's articulating something that words can't quite get to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next question I have is drawn again from your chapter on poetic language.
Yeah.
You write that it's critical that we attend to language, particularly its prior poetic nature, so that we begin to rediscover that ontology, that reality of a participatory vision. How do we practically, like, this notion of attending to our language so that we can rediscover this participatory vision, which is, I think, the cry of the human heart, for meaning. I mean, when you say participatory vision, it's really meaning and purpose to why we're here and what we're doing.
Yeah, I don't know if I have, there are probably spiritual practices that could evoke that kind of awareness. There's a girl named Simone Kotva who's doing work on like spiritual exercises and things like this that bring that kind of awareness.
Interrupt you. What would be an example of a spiritual exercise? What does that mean?
It could be anything, like just simply prayer or meditation, the kinds of different activities, going on a walk, or a kind of centering prayer where we let go, or like the Spanish mystics would talk about recollection or detachment, like the ways of letting go of the things or surrendering things, the idols, the things that we think need to be a certain way as we enter into prayer and say, no, I'm here to just simply receive. I think when that quote has to do with, in Barfield, the connection with the imagination, the way I would describe this, and again, I don't think that Barfield would necessarily, I don't know if he'd agree with me or not, but you know, when you read poetry, it unlocks something within you that was subconscious maybe at the moment, and everything just comes to the surface, and you feel it. You kind of feel, Barfield is really, he's really interested in that. He's really interested in that experience. That experience that comes from that as like more truthful than how I think about something. And so for him, bringing those, again, this is, maybe we could use the language of subjective because it's internal, it's my experience, it's whatever. He thinks that has a very profound influence on the way that we see the world. He also sees that this internal metaphorical kind of poetic language that we normally think of is like just reduced to the subject or the person reflecting upon it, tells us something very, very significant about the reality of the world itself. It changes our perceptions of things. It literally has a way of changing our perceptions. If we're feeling down and we read something that lifts us, we're probably going to love differently. That's the most basic way I would kind of describe it. There are other like philosophical elements in that have to do with broader pictures about reality, but I think it would take a long time, and maybe we'll get to it as we work through this. Yeah.
Interesting. So I think when you describe that experience of poetry, or let's just say art, any
effective kind of aesthetic
manifestation of this truth in a form that what I would call, it's arresting. It circumvents my intentions, whatever I've thought I'm going to do, and it causes me to freeze in almost worship, because there's something going on interacting with this piece, with these words, that reveals deeper truth. I really like about it when you use the word participatory vision, what I think of in those experiences, because we've all had them. I even think of one like basketball, right? You know, I love basketball. There's an iconic scene to me where University of Duke is playing the team I loved, Kentucky, and Christian Laettner. This is a highly regarded game for those of you who don't watch basketball.
Is this the turnaround at the five? Grant Hill.
Game winner, Grant Hill. It's in the Eastern Regional Finals in New Jersey, 1992, many years ago, but still considered one of the greatest basketball games ever.
2.1 seconds left. No team has repeated as NCAA champions since UCLA did it in 1973.
You know, one of the things I've seen Duke do in the past in situations like this is try for the quick pass to half court and call a quick timeout so they can get in better shooting range.
There's the pass to Laettner. Puts it up. Yes!
And Thomas, his teammates, jumps onto the scorer's table, completely overcome, with his hands on his head, And all he's doing, because it's just the TV screen, you don't know what he's saying, but you can read his lips. He's saying, "Oh my God," over and over again. And I've thought about how that expression is universal in moments of transcendence, both for good and horror, right?
Yeah.
And there's something that overcomes us when we encounter these transcendent glimpses where we all cry out, "Oh my God."
Yeah.
And we're articulating, I guess my point is, I think we're articulating, our language is revealing what we all know.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that lines up with my understanding of what's taking place in those moments. Of course, we need to sift these experiences, and the Christian tradition gives us all kinds of ways for discerning those experiences, those encounters, to make sure that that's why it's good to have healthy people around us. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. Something beyond. The other thing about that is that I can't create those experiences, right? If you get into a thing where you're trying to create those, you're moving towards addiction or something. Like it's
or idolatry. Healthy. I mean, it's maybe those are the same thing.
Yeah, one and the same. So I think that's the other thing about, like, while I can maybe have a kind of what Barfield would call prosaic way of describing something using discursive reason or things like this, that there's something about that draws us kind of, it maybe, I mean, I would like to use the language of it perfects reason. I don't want to say,
that's good.
I'm very careful to say, like, what we're not talking about is what poetry as just this, airy theory idea that, like, I do what I want, this aesthetic life that Kierkegaard talks about, where you're just doing whatever you want. This is much more metaphysically kind of bound. And what I mean by that, it's connected to reality, it's connected to ultimate reality, it's connected to reason as well. Like D.C. Schindler, one of my another theologians that I really respect, has an article on this called, like, surprised by reason or something like that we're kind of surprised. The reason is kind of surprised by these things, but we're not going necessarily outside of the bounds of I think that's when things become Gnostic. That's the danger of that.
Well, and as you articulated earlier, where it can become an addiction or something, like, we're not content for whatever reason. We're not content for that experience to be what it was. We have to manufacture something of it.
That's dangerous.
And turn it into something it might not have been
spiritually,
to be.
That's really, it'll catch up to you, because all the spiritual masters will tell you can't seek consolation in the idea that we're, the feelings of God. In fact, God will withdraw those from you. So I always tell people, it's like, could you imagine if I, like, only love my wife because she does nice things for me, and at the moment she stops doing it, like, I won't have a thing to do with her. It would be terrible. Like, oftentimes that's how I related to God for the first, like, half of my existence. Yeah.
Well, how else do you know that God loves you unless you have material blessings?
Oh, I know. I need them.
Okay. Poetic language continuing.
Yeah.
Could you attempt to explain what Barfield believes based on this quote? When a word ceases to be heard as a symbol, it appears only as a sign. Thus, thousands of words, which were originally poetic words, owing their existence to the imagination, lose their vitality and harden into mummies of prose.
Did I say that?
You did. Well, no, it's Barfield.
Yeah, I was going to say, that doesn't sound like me. It sounds way more articulate. Yeah, that fits again with his history of he sees, like, literally, when he studies the history of the meaning of words, they move from this kind of poetic expression to something that's more material, noun-like. Charles Taylor, in A Secular Age, I think it's in The Secular Age, uses the example of, is it bad or is this Barfield's? Well, Charles Taylor does this too, but the idea of, like, bad blood, when we use that term now, it's often very metaphorical. Barfield would say, no, it wasn't once metaphorical. It was once metaphorical and physical. These two things, like, to say someone had bad blood and was, like, ill-willed towards someone, they literally thought their blood was, like, something in their blood was was bad.
Well, like
Yeah.
the
or it's black bile, I think. That
yeah,
one of them
the
uses. I
four
can't remember
humors,
which one it
right?
is. Yeah.
The early idea that our liquids in our bodies connected
Exactly.
to our disposition.
So the language that we now separate. So this is an example for Barfield. Like now when we say it, it has no material reference. It's metaphor. It's just, he's like, no, that's not. He's like, when that originated, those two went together. The behavior, the interior manifestation of the humans, the kind of the bad blood of relational bad blood was correlated with the physical bad blood. So that would be an example of how he sees these, and he sees this everywhere. In that, this example of how like something starts as a metaphor and becomes mere metaphor, and then separated from like the physical bad blood.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if we were to return, or I should say maybe reintegrate, that's probably a better word, how would that manifest? Would we have to be conscientious in our language to the degree that we begin to actually ask questions? So that expression, bad blood, raises a great point, because to me, it internalizes the issue.
Yeah.
So you could say, I think the kids, as I understand it today, say they have beef.
Yeah.
Right?
Same thing.
So
right.
I don't even know what that means.
Who knows where that came from?
What,
Did that one day become
I'm going to have to ask my
connected
daughters.
to a cow? It probably was.
Right.
Like
there were two cows that got in a fight.
Yeah.
They got
like
beef.
That makes sense.
Maybe our dear friend off camera here, Tom, can tell us later, because he's a younger fellow. Anyway, do you know what beef is? Where it comes from? No.
He's like, I'm
not participating in this
Don't do
nonsense.
this.
So with the bad blood, it changes it to a sort of tension generally to there's something flawed in my system.
Yeah, so it's an interior, exterior kind of way of, they both participate in one of each other. It might be the way Barfield described it. And he thinks that's closer to reality. We're not making any medical claims here, by the way. This is just an example of, do I think someone who's behaving badly, should we then say, well, we should drain their blood? No, that's not. But the one way I've also described this has been, like, how do we evoke this kind of thing if you're asking that? Like, this awareness, this more conscious awareness of the connection we have to God and to the world around us, and how God is, practicing the presence of God, these kinds of things, and how it relates to poetry. I had this experience one time where I was asked to do like a visio on nature at a retreat, and I went out and I sat beside. Yeah, it just means like reflect on nature and see what God is telling you through that experience. This would be one way. Visio, there's Visio Divina, the way we read the scripture. Visio on art, Lectio Divina, and Visio on art. Someone could show you a piece of art. What's God speaking you through this? That kind of thing. We can do. I think that's kind of what this means. And if you, I remember looking down at a rock in the stream, in how like it gets formed over time with the stream moving over it. And this is an objective thing outside of me, right? And I began to see that as a metaphor, as a symbol of my interior life, of how the Lord, represented maybe by the water or the Spirit, like moving over me, and my want to rush that, and my want to see change happen overnight. And like, here's this steady stream all the time. That would be a way of how interior, objective, and subjective come together in a more imaginative way. And I can see like here, God is physically working. He's ordering things within the created order in the same way he is within me. And I'm related to this thing in this way. And where otherwise I might just think of myself as cut off from that. That would be like just one example, I think. Yeah. Of a practical way of understanding what I think he's getting at.
And to your rock in the stream experience, the way in which all of creation is interconnected, because as you describe it, what came to my mind is the concept of formal cause that we discussed earlier, right? Yeah. So you have rainfall, snow melt, whatever, feeding this stream. As you said, it's just continuously flowing, but it has formal causes for its own flowing, right? Yeah. And the temptation, or actually the practice really in modern times, as I think Barfield is saying, and perhaps you're getting at, is we have separated our species from everything else that is fully interactive.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, one things we haven't touched upon, and maybe we'll get to that later, is that this then impacts the way we actually go about living our lives. You can see this in technological advancement. Barfield sees us slowly separating ourselves from the natural world. We now live in air-conditioned, climate-controlled places. He's concerned about what he calls this abstraction of like humans from the natural order. This is why he does come off as a bit of a Luddite. I think it's probably safe to say that.
And a Luddite is a person who's resistant to technology.
Yeah. Any kind of change. And so, like, this, is he nostalgic? Well, maybe, but he also sees this future that is like where romanticism comes of age, where, again, the idea that we're more aware of like our spiritual surroundings. So on the one hand, it can sound like he's concerned about progress, but he's after a certain kind of progress, I guess. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. I've got just a couple more questions here on the poetic language. So this is a quote that I think is quite compelling to me and most helpful. It says, this is page 35, "In essence, what Barfield discovers was that the way one perceives the world is integrally tied with the language one employed to articulate that reality." I think I agree. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the phenomenon of internet memes as a form of language.
Yeah, they would. Any sign, like, language is a sign, right? So it's symbolic of something. It's pointing us to something. Language is pointing us to an interior thought that we have, and it's expressed as a sign. That's typically how it's understood, and then that sign can be communicated to other people. It can be shared as long as we agree upon the parameters of language, which this is like language game stuff in Wittgenstein. But yeah, I think the idea of what Barfield is saying is the connection between the type of language we're using and the way there is a connection between the language we use in the way that we see things. And he also is not alone in this. I think you see this in modern philosophy, that this attempt to bring everything within the bounds of reason actually says we can't have poetic language involved in this.
I see.
So it's limited to begin with. It's circular, is what someone like Hamann would argue, the guy that wrote the Metacritique of Kant, that like modern philosophy in its sundering from, this is my view, theology, has to do with the rejection of kind of worshipful poetic language. So it's a syllogistic. I mean, the philosophers out there are probably wanting to murder me for saying that so simply.
There's not many watching, so you're okay.
Yeah, you're right. But what I mean by that is it starts with the premise that there's a certain kind of cutoff to our language. And this has to be referential language. It has to be objective language. And then we build what we know from there. And anything that exceeds that, we can't know it. We have to stop. But it already begins by establishing an ontology, like the language we're going to use.
So the restrictions that are put in place.
It's put in place only allows for the discovery of the restrictions put in place.
I see.
And so it's syllogistic in that way. And what I think Barfield was really on about now became it's more prevalent when I was doing my PhD. I'm not up with all the trendiness right now, but language became, in philosophy, particularly with Derrida and postmodernism, in what's his name, Gadamer, the language became like a key all of a sudden. Like, it was like, wait a second, language is how we articulate what we know. It's how we perceive things. If we shift that, we're going to start perceiving things differently. If we have a language that divides physical from material, that either says something about the way we're perceiving things or the way they mirror one another. Our perceptions mirror our language. Yeah. And I think like the move in more trendy circles was to actually have conversations about language. I think John Bett's work, if there's theologians listening, is really good on this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask a follow-up question, because you've sort of, with your hands, you were describing like a box around the formal school of philosophy, let's call it.
Yeah. And not everyone would fall into that. I would think of that more in what's called the analytic tradition of philosophy. But even in Heidegger was taking this up in the continental tradition. What were the parameters that we were putting around language? And if if all of our knowledge is just simply reducible to language, Heidegger would go, well, then we can't really know much. But where other people would say, well, wait a second, it depends on the parameters. And anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, outside of this box is poetry.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, is this a uniquely modern phenomenon? Is that really what Barfield's driving at? Sort of the categorization.
Yes. Yeah.
And the separation in the academy, as you described, theology separate from philosophy. Where at one point they all flowed downstream from that.
Yeah, they all, and in fact, all like the humanities and the sciences, like you had to know, Barfield was very concerned with what he called the fragmentation of knowledge, like that it would become specialized and someone could work in one area. You see this in the scientific method as well. So the scientific method is based on the bracketing. Famously in Newton, you get the bracketing of formal cause. It's right in the opening of the Principia Mathematica. He opens it by saying, we don't need Aristotle's formal cause to do physics, to know how one thing bumps into another. But the word physics is this word we use for nature. The movement, how things move. And he brackets that out. He's very aware that he's doing that because he's just like, we're measuring gravity.
Has to be aware, right?
Yeah, we're measuring gravity. But like by the time you get to some philosophies of science now, so again, you begin by bracketing something, and then over time, it's a methodology, and then over time, it becomes an ontology. Well, we've forgotten that altogether. We're going to just try to do without that. And that's kind of, I think, what Barfield would say, like, this method of analytic philosophy is great. It serves a great purpose, but you can't begin. If you begin by bracketing certain notions of reality out from the get-go, and then you come back and say, by the way, they don't exist, it's a very circular argument. It's syllogistic.
Yeah.
And again, the scientific method serves an incredible purpose. It puts people on the moon. It does amazing AI. Like, all these things are great. But if you then go, therefore, humans are reducible to just like mechanisms in their brain, because that's what AI is, you forget that you had to, there's all kinds of other philosophical problems with that, but you don't then make an ontology out of a methodology. That's when it becomes a problem. And I think that's really the easiest way I would describe Barfield's angst about a lot of these things.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. I like that. I'm not done with this thought, I guess, because I'm feeling prompted not to go on. I'm just thinking, because you know me, I tend to think broader. I'm not often a reductionist myself.
No, I call you the Renaissance man. Like there's not a thing you don't know.
Well, there are many subjects about which I am aware, but few that I am deeply familiar. But with respect to formal education as a means of cultivating the human, it is all that we really know. It's all that we've had, all we've experienced. And yet, as you described, that deconstruction, specialization, categorization, separation aspect, I wonder if you have any thoughts about its effect on wellness as a being, wholeness.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I understand, and like you, I appreciate the advances that have come about through specialization.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about just the broader nature of a person.
I was just listening to a lecture the other day where a friend of mine, Brandon Rickabaugh, was conflating, maybe conflating is not the word, but there was a correlation between an increase in technological prowess and a kind of loss of meaning and disillusionment, isolation that we're experiencing in generations now. I don't think that has to be the case. I don't know why there's a correlation between the two of them. I think that, like you and I were talking earlier, personally, for some reason, growing up in America, the ends, the telos, the purpose of my life was to really honestly retire.
Get a good job so you can have enough to retire.
Yeah. I mean, that was really the goal of life. Other people would add, if you're Christian, well, be nice to my wife, be a good father, those kinds of things. But as Christian as I was and am, I cannot escape that as being the end goal of my life. And what if it was something different? Like, virtue, becoming a virtuous human being, becoming the kind of person that I would like to hang around with, the kind of person that saw the good in people, the kind of person that was, but not fake, a kind of person that like had integrity, a kind of person that increasingly we saw with COVID, that economic economy would outride human wellness, care for humans. That was what I think political philosophers, economists took away from the pandemic, that we're going to work, whether it killed people or not. We had to go to work because our bottom lines were going to be, and maybe that's contentious for some people, but I think the philosophical takeaway from that was that, and then the most recent election was driven primarily, my understanding is the exit polls. I'm not making any political statements. The exit polls were about the economy, money in my pocket. I relate to that. I just did a retreat with a group of young professionals, and the thing that stood out the most to them was how that ideology, that goal of earning in financial stability will take out any kind of virtue. That competing with that is so difficult. I don't know if that's unique to Americans. I don't know if it's unique to me as like the context I grew up in. I didn't grow up wealthy. I'm not trying to be wealthy by any means. But I think that, like, what are the ends, or can I reimagine the end of my life, as which we do. If we think about our eulogies, it's like stuff like, we don't want to be like, he was a hard worker and he dedicated his life to having a nice house, and man, did he have a great retirement plan. Like, no one says that. No one ever even, like, it would be very odd to get to a funeral and have people talking like that. We'd be like, this person was horrible. Like, that's kind of the thing that I can't get out of, that I joke about that all the time. Like,
it's a fascinating indicator of the reality that we all still deeply fear death, that we pursue comfort as the end goal. Right? Which, of course, that's the most uncomfortable transition in the world, is passing from this life to the next. And those who do it well, we are astounded by. But it's so rare. And to your point regarding recent turmoil or events in geopolitical and cultural action, I do think it continually reveals that we have elevated comfort as the end goal.
In if we bring it back to Barfield, this obsession with material things, having things like, I remember overhearing, when I was living in England, overhearing a German person talking to a British person at this place called the Staff Club at the University of Nottingham. And they were so, and I'd never even thought about this, they couldn't believe the German woman had just come to visit someone she knew in America. And they don't know I'm American. I can overhear them. And she goes, they store their stuff in storage facilities. I was like, well, yeah, of course we do. Like, it's amazing. Like, and if you've ever had a storage facility like I do, every time you go back to it, you're like, what is this stuff? Why do I even have? Why am I paying money to store stuff that I throw out a year or two later? And I remember thinking, wow, that's the perception of someone, who's not from America.
I'm ecstatic because our family achieved storage unit freedom.
That is amazing.
Last month, after almost 4 years of indentured storage.
I have an excuse. Our place is furnished, so we don't own any real furnished stuff. You don't have
to justify.
Listen, I'm trying to sound pious because we own so little. I have that storage, is what I'm saying.
I see. Anyway, that's a great indicator. Our culture. My gosh. Let me ask you one final question on poetic language. I think this is a very prominent one in conversations today, particularly online, particularly among the younger generation as they explore meaning. Really. Because I think at the heart of what you're talking about with that innovation and the increasing anxiety is, I think there's a beauty and a poetic element to mystery still existing. We have reduced and extracted mystery pretty substantially in our lifetimes. So you wrote, Barfield's ontology allows for an active participation in the logos, the source of all creativity. And I think there's been a renaissance of that term logos in the last decade. In particular, Jordan Peterson, who's a very prominent Canadian psychologist, he's all over the place.
he makes much of this term when he talks about orienting the human
Okay.
to the logos.
I didn't know that.
And I'm just curious if you have any idea on Barfield's definition of logos, how it would comport of the use of the term as an orienting goodness, or how it is in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, right? It translating in English for us, the word became flesh, but that is actually, that word we use the word for in the Greek is logos. So just curious about that.
Barfield isn't a theologian. I think he would definitely agree with that, by which I mean he doesn't really do theology. He also doesn't interact with much theology. You just see some Aquinas in him. He definitely knows, he's aware of it, but you don't see him interacting with it a great deal. I think there's an article he wrote on language much later in life. I want to say he was in his 80s, maybe even he's on Trinitarian thought in how that relates to this idea of the Logos and how we, quote unquote, participate in that. I want to answer this without sounding overly ethereal. For him, I think the idea of meaning, it's not something to be found maybe outside of ourselves. I don't mean it's not found in a kind of material vision of things. It's found in this internal sense of connection with something beyond ourselves, but yet within us in like proper theological language. So as it relates to language, the idea of logos, without getting into all the kind of different opinions on how language origins and these kinds of things. In Barfield, the way I understand it, again, that logos represents the actual. We potentially can know stuff, we can articulate things, but to the extent that we're open to, Christians would say God in and through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, we gain access to a vision beyond our natural capacities, you could say. Barfield doesn't say that, but he has enough within his philosophy that allows for something like that. He speaks, and this is probably most clear in his book called Unancestral Voice.
Okay.
Christians might call it the creator, the God, the Logos, whatever. He sees this voice as unancestral. It's not necessarily like linked to us, but yet it's beyond our ancestry.
Okay.
And he talks a lot about that in that book. What that means as related to meaning. It says something like, while I participate in the creation and the meaning of life, meaning of existence, meaning of identity and all these things, I can't do that on my own. I have to draw on something beyond myself, the actual, if I have potentiality. I have to draw on something that transcends even the created order, essentially. That because otherwise I'm just repeating what I hear. So proper creativity is not mere repetition of we all know that. If I want to be trendy, I start mimicking Bob Dylan or something like that. Do you know what I mean? We all know that that's not real artists. It's the uniqueness that comes out of it. But it's repeating something that's actual. Like art and poetry isn't some eerie theory thing. It's participating in something that's very real, but yet it also kind of inspires us. It's something like the idea of a muse or something that kind of inspires us to, and I pick up on a theory of a philosophical theory that's Platonic, and then Kierkegaard uses it, called non-identical repetition. I get it, I think, from John Milbank. I've talked to him about it. It basically just means that creativity or reality consists in a non-identical repetition. It's a paradoxical language. So within each tree that we see, there's a repetition of, say, the oak tree, right? We see it. That's how we recognize it as an oak tree. It's in the form. It's in the form. We recognize the form of an oak. That's just, in Platonic language, it's a universal form that tree participates in, that we name oak. We call it oak tree or whatever, but that's how we know it's there. One oak tree is never the same as the other, yet we recognize it as sameness and difference. This is Trinitarian language. This is a Christian account of reality. And I do think that Barfield's account of Logos is something like that, where we participate in words, we participate in the naming of things and the identifying of things. Our words are doing this. But every time we do this, the creative act is one that participates in something that's already given, but then accentuates it in some way. Yeah. It's like when someone comes to play a piano. This is how reality works. I've used this example before. When we come to play a piano, you cannot just go up and start beating on the piano. If you don't play within the form of music, no one's going to listen to it. No one's going to be around. So that form is restrictive. You have to enter into that form. But once you've entered into that identical form that everyone has to play in, then you can begin to improvise. And the most liberated kind of creative is working within those forms, but they're doing something unique. And that'd be like the example of non-identical repetition. So they're playing within repeated forms of music, or I don't know music, so I could be butchering this, but you have to play within certain limitations. That's the formal reality. And so the world is like that. Yeah.
And that
Addicts is like that too.
think of the essence of what some might perceive as monotonous training, that repetitive practice.
A perfect example. It's not fun.
No, but it leads to that freedom that you're describing
Yeah.
when a person can improvise. I mean, there is no limitation of what a human can improvise once they've mastered their craft.
Yeah.
And you see that in metallurgy, you see it in woodworking, you see it in sports, right? So would you say then that that manifestation, whatever it is, when we describe a virtuoso or a transcendent experience, would you say that that is a contact to a higher plane, or it's just a momentary fulfillment of the potential that we all have?
Yeah, I think it could be good to use metaphors to articulate that, because I tend to think it's in my own spiritual life. It's normally I'm not consciously aware of the presence of God in most cases, and those things kind of, this is here, but it's happening all the time. But I just and this is why, again, for Barfield, the idea of poetry as taking something unconscious and making it conscious. The idea, the theory of repetition and not identical repetition, this is what lit is then. This is why when we go to church, we do the same thing, wrote things over and over again. If it becomes merely repetitive, it becomes dead. It loses its meaning. But if it's done in an inspired kind of way, if it were lifted up, then it is a truly kind of praise and worship. Yeah.
I had a thought there with the poetic. So to conclude our conversation on poetic language, as we discussed the sort of monotony of practice, right? We've both played sports, and you go to practice every day, whatever. And the goal, of course, is to get into the game and experience it at a higher level. But would you encourage people to specifically read poetry as a discipline that could awaken, as you described, from Barfield's perspective? Maybe you'd agree or disagree. Like, that is bringing the unconscious to the surface.
You know me, I've never written poetry in my life. You're incredibly gifted. It's crazy what you can do. I've never experienced that. Reading poetry, however, has been very helpful for me, and it's helped me get in touch with things that I've been closed off to, areas of my life that God might want to be drawing to my attention. I do think, like with anything, we need to have wise teachers around us, because just a mere aesthetic experience of something can be. That's why discernment in the Christian tradition becomes so important, particularly in the early forms of Christianity. We need to learn how to discern the spirits of things. So yes, absolutely. But having good and wise people around you that can be like, well, maybe you shouldn't completely follow up on that idea. Like, that's great, but let's just wait a little bit and see what God does with that. Like, so having those rules for discernment, that's what I would say is important too, as much as the experience is too. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word effulgent. Effulgent. E-F-F-U-L-G-E-N-T. Effulgent. It's an adjective that means shining brightly or radiant. Do you know anyone who emanates joy or goodness? You could say of them that they are effulgent. I would hope to say of you that you're effulgent. It's an interesting word because its sound doesn't evoke its meaning like many of our words. And maybe that's why it stands out a little bit and why we chose to afford it the luxury of being today's sponsoring word. Effulgent originated in the mid-18th century or earlier as effulgence. It's from the Latin, so many things are, meaning shining brightly. Shining brightly. Man, I love shining brightly. I don't know about you, but shining dimly just doesn't have the same effect. So I want to encourage you as you go about your day, radiate, shine brightly, especially in a time when people are tempted to think that the world is just too dark. The only way we counteract that is by being effulgent ourselves. So be effulgent. Wherever you go, shine a little brighter. Thank you, Effulgent, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.